What's going on, everybody? Gareth here with FCP Euro. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the N20 and N26 engine. Pretty infamous. This is probably also going to be a highly debated comment section. I can already see it. Fact of the matter is the N20 and N26 engine is a very commonly wide used engine by BMW, everywhere from the X1, X3, X4, basically the F25, F26 vehicles. Then we have the 2 Series, F22, F23, the 3 Series, F30, F31, and also the F34 3 Series GT, the 4 Series, so F32, F33, F36, the 5 Series F10, F15 X5s, literally the list goes on and on and on. This engine was used in a ton of different BMW vehicles, and we're going to talk about some of those things today. Fortunately, I have a lot of DIY videos currently up on our YouTube channel that talks about a lot of the common repairs, including some of the bigger ones. But we're gonna start with probably the most debated, most commonly discussed thing about the N20 and the N26 engine, which is, well, timing components. BMW actually recently issued, not a recall, but basically they're willing to pay for anybody who's had a timing chain replacement done on their vehicle, willing to repay those people have had to do it because it is such a common problem. Pretty much what you're gonna see, plastic guides, which, well, yeah, they do wear over time and they do break. Sometimes you'll see some of these tangs break off, but the guides are really not the problem. The problem is the chain itself actually elongating and the tensioner itself, which you see right here. This is a hydraulic style tensioner, so it uses oil pressure. Once this tensioner has gone all the way out to pick up the slack from the chain, it can't do anything else. The chain is going to make a lot of noise inside the timing cover, and if you have a ton of wear on the timing chain itself, where the individual links, the pins that hold the links together, are all worn out, the risk is that the timing chain will break. If the timing chain breaks, it's an interference engine. You are going to have valve to piston contact, and now you're looking at a much bigger repair. So these engines are notoriously noisy anyway, between lifter sound and injector noise, but the timing chain being extremely loose inside the timing cover, that is a very distinct sound. We actually did discuss that a little bit during our timing chain video, so if you want to know a little bit more about that, we'll throw a link to that. But basically, if you hear a rattle on startup, more times than not, that is going to be your timing chain making the noise. Along with that, BMW also did an update to the oil pump chain module, which is this right here. This is in the bottom of the engine, involves removing the oil pan and also doing the timing service for both the crank and the cams. You're also going to replace this at the same time. So not only does this drive the oil pump, but this also drives the balance shaft. And the balance shaft is extremely important on a 4-cylinder engine. Basically, since 4 cylinders are unbalanced by design, you have to have some way of reducing any types of harmonics inside the engine. And so what you really don't want to have a situation there in which, let's say the tensioner comes loose on this over time, or again, chain wear or guide wear, those types of issues. You don't want a situation in which, well, number one, the oil pump no longer pumps oil through the engine, and number two, you don't want a situation where the balance shaft is out of sync with the rest of the engine. That's going to cause excessive wear down the road, could lead to other problems. So really, if you're doing the timing chain, you're also going to have to do this at the same time. So in regards to the timing chain service life, there isn't really a set mileage on it. There's probably N20s out there that are 200,000 miles and have never needed it. I would say those are probably a little bit in the rare case, but realistically speaking, if you're coming up on 80 to 100,000 miles, you might start noticing the noise and other things going on. So that's kind of where you'd start looking to see if you're experiencing timing chain wear. If there is no noise on startup, or there's no rattling noise in the timing cover, you're probably still fine. If you really wanted to check, you could pull out the tensioner out of the engine block and you could measure how much elongation has happened on the timing chain, but without special tools, you're not really gonna be able to kind of get a good feel for that. So really, it's just something you want to keep an eye on. If you are hearing that noise, you are going to want to address it sooner rather than later. Fortunately, we have an entire video all the tools, all the details on that repair so you can see for yourself. So whether you intend to do it yourself or whether you're gonna have somebody else do it for you, it's educational both ways around. So it's a two-part video and we'll give you the information on that. So we're gonna move on from the daunting subject of timing chain and all that related problems that are known about the N20 and N26 engine. We're gonna start talking about some of the more common maintenance things. Water pump and thermostat, these are all external to the engine on the N20 engine and the N26 engine. The water pump is an electric water pump. These, well, you know, we have a couple of cars here in the parking lot with upwards of 120,000 miles that are still on the factory water pump, which is pretty amazing. These electric water pumps are relatively reliable. They very rarely have any types of external leaks. Usually when they fail, there's a bunch of fault codes that'll be stored on the DME. We'll go ahead and provide a list of those potential fault codes you'll see. The other indication that your water pump has failed is your polar fan for the radiator is gonna be on full high all the time, and you also get warnings on the instrument cluster telling you that the vehicle is starting to overheat. More times than not, unless you have a serious coolant leak, it's the water pump that's failed. And if the water pump has failed, you're also gonna replace a thermostat at the same time. It's really recommended to do both, not just replace one or the other. Just do both at the same time. These are both electronically controlled, so just take care of them at the same time and you won't have to worry about it again for a long period of time. We do have a video on replacing both the water pump and the thermostat on an F33 series. It's gonna be pretty much the same for any N20 powered or N26 powered BMW. So if you wanna check that out for the details on that, go ahead and provide you a link for that as well. Moving down here, we have ignition coils and spark plugs. These ignition coils have been used by BMW for a very long time, actually dating back from September of 2002 onward. This is a Delphi variant. BMW currently offers 3 different flavors of this style coil. We just kind of call these generically a pencil style coil. Currently BMW recommends Delphi for the N20 and the N26 engine. You could put Eldor in there, you could put Bosch in there, they all fit, but we pretty much default back to what BMW recommends. I don't think that one has a performance advantage over the other. The key on these coils is they do fail and they fail randomly. There isn't really a mileage that happen. You could go a lifetime on the car until you get rid of it without having a problem. You can go 30,000 miles and have one of these things fail. It's totally random, but what a lot of people will do is when they replace the spark plug, so this is your factory NGK plug here for the N20, the N26 engine. NGK says that these spark plugs are good for 100,000 miles. Yeah, you could probably go that long without really any problems, but we recommend something a little bit more reasonable, about 50,000 miles. You are gonna need a 14mm 12-point spark plug. This is unique to this style plug. BMW uses this on pretty much any new engine. Pretty much anything with direct injection, it's gonna use one of these style plugs. So 14mm 12-point spark plug socket's gonna be required. It needs to be a thin wall, otherwise you're not gonna gain access to it. Like I said, 50,000 miles on your spark plugs. Now, in regards to the ignition coil failures, one thing to mention on the N20 and the N26 engine is the DME. We have seen some cases where the ignition coil drivers do fail. Whether it's the ignition coil that fails and then causes the driver inside the DME to fail, or the DME driver fails and therefore causes all these other issues, you know, it's a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. It's really hard to diagnose in some cases, and that kind of goes back to the whole point about when you do the plugs, also do the coils at the same time. Hopefully alleviate any type of extreme situation on that end, but these coil failures have been tied to potential DME failure. But that's a very extreme case. Fortunately, replacing the ignition coils is very simple. No real tools required. Literally just disconnect it, pull it up, replace it, no big deal. Good old Serpentine belts. We all know these. Well, BMW doesn't have a service interval for these, and realistically speaking, there isn't a known or set service interval. Continental, they do recommend 80,000 miles on these Serpentine belts. You can replace them earlier as needed. So for example, if you start hearing like a squeaking noise in the engine bay, and let's say it's the tensioner pulley that's making noise, it is recommended that when you replace the Serpentine belt that you also replace the tensioner and any of the associated pulleys, because really the belt wears in with the pulleys at the same time. So there's material transfer from both the belt to the plastic pulleys and from the plastic pulley to the belt. Sometimes what will happen is if you replace the belt but leave the other pulleys in place, such as the tensioner pulley, since the whole accessory setup is relatively simple on the N20 engines, you might notice some types of sounds afterwards. So what we recommend is replacing the tensioner, which includes the pulley and the belt, at a roughly 80,000 miles, and you should be perfectly fine. These things tend to be ignored for long periods of time until one day they just inevitably fail. So if you're coming up on 80,000 miles or you're past 80,000 miles and you haven't replaced the belt, or you don't know if it's been replaced, that is something to look at. So if you're new to BMW, you might not know what these are. But if you come from a long history of BMW ownership, you're gonna know all about these gaskets. This right here is your oil filter housing gasket. This seal is the oil filter housing to the cylinder head. And this is the oil cooler seal. This one right here is responsible for a lot of heartbreak. On the N52, N54, and N55 engine, that gasket failure could result in the serpentine belt slipping off the engine and being ingested by the engine through the front crankshaft seal. That's because of the harmonic balancer design. I could safely say that's not going to be a problem on the N20 or N26 engine because it doesn't share the same harmonic balancer and crank pulley design where the harmonic balancer is in front of the crank pulley, forcing the belt backwards into the engine. But when these gaskets, and this one particularly, fails or becomes hard and brittle over time, it will leak a whole bunch of oil. So if you start up your car, and let's just say it's been sitting in your driveway, the parking space overnight, and you pull out and you see a couple of drips on the ground and it's oil, it is most likely this gasket right here. It is pretty involved to replace the oil filter housing gasket on the N20 and N26 engine because of the design of the intake manifold. The rearward housing bolt is blocked by the intake manifold. And so you do have to pull the intake manifold back. And to pull the intake manifold back, you have to remove the engine computer or the DME because it's on top of the intake manifold. We have a full DIY video that explains that process. It is definitely something you can do yourself if you're mechanically inclined. It's just all this additional work to get to one bolt, but you do have to do it to replace that oil filter housing gasket because, like I said, this gasket right here, just prone for leaks. I know this thing looks a little goofy looking, but this right here is the direct fuel injector. This specific one is an EU6 injector. But one thing to note on the N20 and N26 engine is there's two different fueling strategies, if you will, for the engine. It's either EU5 or EU6. These injectors do fail. However, these have shown to be relatively reliable. This same injector is used on the N55, the N63 TU, can go on and on and on. But basically BMW went over to this Bosch direct injector style. And for the most part, way more reliable than, let's say, the N54 injector would have been, the piezo style injectors, and also a little bit more affordable. But these injectors do fail, and the good news is if you have one injector that's bad, you could just replace one injector, but we recommend replacing all four. Before ever ordering injectors for any N20 or N26 powered BMW, you need to identify whether you have an EU5 or an EU6 injector. You can use a scan tool that can read the installed injectors off. They're not interchangeable. So don't think that you can put an EU5 in an EU6 or an EU6 in an EU5 engine. You need to install the injector that came in the car because it is literally part of the fueling strategy for the vehicle. Thing to note on these, you do have to do a DME calibration or a flow rate calibration, which there is a little number on here that'll tell you what the flow rate is. You need to program that into the DME. Fortunately, a lot of lower level scan tools that can at least do factory level types of services can do this for you. So for example, the Autel MX808, which we use in a lot of our videos, will do that service, and that can also identify the injectors that you have. The service on this is relatively simple, relatively straightforward. You will need a special puller tool in order to remove the injector from the cylinder head. I don't think that you can just pull them out by hand. If you can, you're really strong. Yeah, they do fail. It's not a super common failure that does occur, but it is something to be aware of. And along with the high pressure fuel injection system, you also have the high pressure fuel pump. The high pressure fuel pump is a tappet style. It's actually driven off the exhaust cam. They're relatively reliable. I would say there's really two types of failures for that. It's either the fuel quantity valve that has failed, which is electronically controlled, or the seal fails, allowing fuel to leave the high pressure fuel pump and go into the engine, which then mixes with the engine oil. And when you have a lot of fuel mixed in with the oil, the engine's gonna be running extremely rich because your crankcase ventilation system is venting fuel vapor from inside the engine back into the intake manifold. If there's ever fuel inside of your oil, 9 times out of 10, it's gonna be the high pressure fuel pump that did that. It's one thing to know about those tappet style high pressure fuel pumps. They do have that potential to leak fuel into the engine. The other thing to note too is early N20 and N26 engines, they would have had an earlier style of a high pressure fuel pump. BMW did an update on that, so it's a different style connector on the fuel quantity control valve. We did do a DIY video showing you how to make the update on that, which involves putting a new pigtail in, but generally you can follow that same DIY for replacing the high pressure fuel pump. And we also have a nice little DIY on how to replace the fuel injectors as well. and how to go about programming the DME for those new compensation values. So right here we have the cam sensor and the crank sensor. There's two cam sensors around the front of the timing cover. The cam sensors are, I'd say, a little bit more failure prone than the crank sensor is, but all they really do is they measure the relative position of the cam and the crank. This information is used by the DME for, things like variable cam timing, fuel injection strategies, all of this stuff. So these are reference sensors. Usually when they fail, you're gonna get an open circuit fault code. So it would say like, intake cam position or intake cam position sensor or cam position sensor circuit A, open circuit. If you see anything that says open circuit, we do recommend you do check the wiring on the engine harness to make sure that there isn't a fray or a broken wire or anything like that. But generally speaking, if you have any kind of fault code that says crank or cam open circuit, more than likely, it is the cam or crank sensor that has physically failed internally. If you do have some Vanos related faults, what we typically see is a lot of people have a Vanos related problem. It'll say camshaft either over, in a retarded position or an advanced position when it's not supposed to be. A lot of people want to jump the gun and think that it's a camshaft position sensor failure. It is not a cam position sensor failure. In those situations, that's a Vanos mechanical problem, which fortunately is not really that common on the N20 or N26 engine. But just because it says camshaft, don't assume it's a camshaft position sensor failure. That could be mechanically related, which could be related to oil pressure problems or a multitude of other things. So just be careful that when you're looking at these sensors that you're buying them for a condition and a fault that is specifically related to the camshaft position sensor not functioning. A no start, for example, without the crank sensor, the engine will not start. The engine will start with a failed cam sensor. Just make sure that the correlated fault code makes sense that it could be a sensor failure, and obviously do the appropriate diagnostics to be 100% sure. But we see particularly this cam sensor ordered a lot for Vanos related problems that have nothing to do with the cam position sensor. So just be sure you've done a thorough diagnosis or had a thorough diagnosis done before you replace these parts. Jumping on over to this part of the bench, we have our cosmetic cover for the engine. You're probably wondering, why do I care about this thing? Well, you do, because if you have an early style N20 or N26, you're gonna have this vacuum reservoir on it. And this vacuum reservoir is for the turbocharger wastegate. So there's different turbochargers that are installed. We're gonna get to turbochargers a little bit later, but the general gist of this is if you have a pneumatic wastegate turbocharger, the vacuum canister or vacuum reservoir for that wastegate actuator is part of this engine cover. And this engine cover is replaced only for one reason. You didn't realize it was here, you went to yank it off, and you broke these tabs off. There's no fix for that. You have to replace this entire cover, which is relatively expensive. So if you see any vacuum lines running alongside of the engine and coming in here and stuff coming over here, be careful when you're removing this. Make sure that these vacuum lines are disconnected, and you're gonna save yourself a little bit of grief. If you have an electronic style wastegate, kind of like what this turbo is here, don't really worry about that engine cover. Now that we talked about that engine cover, this is the valve cover. It's plastic, and it has a built-in crankcase ventilation valve. So, first of all, BMWs and valve cover gasket leaks are pretty synonymous with each other. It's just a thing. It has a rubber valve cover gasket here, which if you have a valve cover gasket leak, you can just buy a valve cover gasket set, a vacuum pump seal, high pressure fuel pump seal, and your Valvetronic seal, and you could just replace those gaskets because they will eventually leak. It's almost a guarantee. But the real reason you would replace this entire valve cover is because of the crankcase ventilation system, which is right here. So there is actually a port that comes up from the block right here, comes into this chamber here. So your diaphragm valve is here. It's all built into the valve cover. And then you have this little portion right here. There's a hose that comes from here and then goes into the inlet to the turbo. There's like basically a pipe down below that this crankcase vent line will go to. So any vapor that's pulled up from the crankcase is brought in here and then it's dumped back into the engine so that it can be burned. If you break this, or the valve inside has failed and you're basically pulling a lot of vacuum on the crankcase, you're gonna have to replace the valve cover. There's really no other way around that. Another thing to note is this valve cover is a mounting point for a lot of other components. So basically, right here, this is where your Valvetronic actuator pokes up through the connector itself. There's a seal that seals this off. You have to buy that separately. It's not included with the valve cover. But this area in here, if this seal fails, you have a lot of oil that'll pull out along here. A high pressure fuel pump mounts here. So basically there's a bridge on the cylinder head where the high pressure fuel pump will basically sandwich the valve cover to that. So this is another area that's pretty sensitive. The vacuum pump right here actually goes through the back of the valve cover. So this is another area for potential leaks. And then right here on the front, this is where the Vanos actuators or camshaft adjuster magnets would sit. So there's a lot of items that sort of pass through or get encapsulated by the valve cover. So any type of service that you're doing that involves working around this valve cover, you want to be careful. You want to make sure that you're not over torquing anything. And also, seeing as this is like a glass fiber reinforced plastic component, plastic and heat and long periods of heat exposure and cooling and heating and cooling and heating, these things will become a little bit brittle over time. So even something as simple as removing it from the cylinder head to do something as simple as replace the valve cover gasket, you could potentially break something off of this. And so with that said, sometimes it's best just replace the valve cover if it needs to come off. But 100% if you have a crankcase ventilation issue, you are gonna have to replace it because it is just integrated into the entire valve cover. It just works as part of the engine. And for us at FCP Euro, we only recommend using genuine valve covers. There's a lot of aftermarket valve covers on the market and we haven't seen one yet, at least at the time of filming this video, that is up to our quality standards. Our number one concerns with the aftermarket valve covers is the quality of the diaphragm being used here. And also we haven't seen one yet where when you look at the flat plane here, we haven't seen one that looks flat. They all have some kind of curvature to them. And just generally for these very complicated and sophisticated style plastic castings, we haven't really seen any aftermarket ones that are really gonna stand up the test of time at this point. Hopefully that can change in the future because these are relatively expensive, but it just kind of is what it is at the moment. The three most common failures of really any turbo, I'd say the two most common, and then there's the other one that's sort of either self-induced or accidentally induced. Lubrication problems, which is probably the most common way that a turbo fails. A internal wastegate failure issue, which if the wastegate fails, the turbo will never build boost, or it could potentially overboost if it's stuck shut versus stuck open. It really depends on that situation. And the other issue is overspeeding of the turbo itself. These things are designed for a specific operating window. So, something simple as you tuned the car to basically overboost from what it was originally intended for, that could cause excessive force on the turbo. That could result in premature wear and eventual failure. But that could be either a mechanical related problem, something else is happening that's causing that, or it could be tuned and that was intentionally done. But for most situations, you're usually gonna find that it's a lubrication problem. And that is particularly an issue when you factor in that a lot of car manufacturers, BMW included, really go for these extended oil change intervals. One thing to mention specifically is that BMW did do some updates on the feed line. So basically the line that feeds the turbo oil, it now has a check valve. So basically oil can't be forced to flow backwards in the system. It can only move forward. So the important thing with that is if the car's been sitting for a very long period of time, the oil will always drain out of the turbo because it's usually a gravity type system. But if oil has been allowed to drain back from the feed, when you start the car, there won't be actually really any oil for the journal bearing. So that would result in small amounts of wear over a long period of time. So BMW did do the update to the feed line so that the inline check valve prevents any drain back through the feed line. So when you're installing a new turbo on any N20, N26 application, or any application with a turbo, we always recommend replace the feed line, replace the turbo line. And if you did have a turbo that 100% failed due to a lubrication issue, number one, make sure the engine has proper oil pressure. And number two, make sure that the feed line and the return line aren't restricted. And you can 100% make sure that that's not the case by replacing those lines. That is always gonna be a recommendation. But like I said, we're gonna have a really in-depth video that talks about how to treat them, how to prime them. For example, something like this turbocharger additive, which you would put in a turbo when you go to install it. This can provide the lubrication for that first startup. But again, we're gonna have a full in-depth video that talks about how to treat these things, how to care for them, how to install them, and how to have a long service life, because these are expensive and you could avoid replacing them. That is the most ideal solution. So with that said, since we talked about some lubrication, another thing that we don't have up here is your oil filter and your oil change. BMW, they hit you with a 10,000 mile oil change interval. No, we don't do that here. 5,000 miles, I would say 7,000 mile tops if you do a lot of highway driving. But realistically, you want to go for the shorter oil change interval, because a lot of the problems that we talked about today, you know, the turbo related issue, the timing related problems, a lot of this is usually due to lubrication problems, which would potentially come from a longer oil change interval. So if you can use some type of additives to help also cut down on wear, so for example, something like Liquid Moly Ceratec, or even the MOS2 additive that you use for the intervals in between the Ceratec treatment, that'll help cut down on wear, that'll help cut down on internal engine friction, and could also help prolong the service life of things like your turbo and things like your timing components. So we've talked about a lot of different topics involving maintenance and things to expect when owning an N20 or N26 powered BMW. A lot of the maintenance and a lot of things that you're gonna deal with when owning one of these cars is just really basic maintenance. Sure, some of the stuff might be a little bit more difficult to access depending on the platform, depending on how the engine's installed, but for the most part, these are relatively easy engines to work on. There's a lot of space in the engine bay because of how compact the engine is, so some of the things that you might run into other BMWs where things are tight are not as tight for that, so that's kind of a bonus. And to be honest with you, you know, the fuel economy, the performances you get out of the engine, it's really pretty good. So realistically speaking, don't be afraid of the N20 and N26. Stay on top of the things that, you know, you are afraid of. But this stuff over here, the basic maintenance things, those are the things that are gonna help you improve the service life of the car. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned a lot about the N20 and N26. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you have personal experience, stories, good or bad, about the N20 and N26, also share those as well. We definitely wanna hear from those of you who have dealt with owning one of these cars with one of these engines. But outside of that, hit that like button if you liked the video. Hit subscribe, we have a lot more videos on the way. As always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.